Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Patricia Villalobos, Awards Committee Chair.
Well, my last time, literally my last time. I'm going to go a little off script. Hopefully I won't get any love notes from the screen down there, but I would like to thank everybody I've met. I'd like to thank my local workforce board, Workforce Solutions Borderplex, CEO Joyce Wilson, COO Leila Melendez, and past board chair Leo Duran for making the opportunity for me to be here to represent all of you. And I've made so many new friends, thousands of people I've met, and I want from the bottom of my heart to thank everybody that supported me, my colleagues, past and present. Thank you for some great dynamic moments on our board meetings. And so I'll miss this, and hopefully I will continue to come as an attendee and not forget the great work you're all doing. So thank you, everyone, for the tireless efforts in our community. Our final award is the W.O. Lawton Business Leadership Award, which is being presented to HydraForce Incorporated and was nominated by Lake County Workforce Development Board in Illinois. Our work is only possible when the business steps up to make a commitment to be a full partner in the board's endeavors. We established the W.O. Lawton Business Leadership Award to honor annually a business or business organization that made the commitment of time, money, and leadership and make its community workforce and economy more vibrant. HydraForce is a private global manufacturer of hydraulic cartridge valves, manifolds, and electro-hydraulic controls. HydraForce has consulted and partnered with the Lake County workforce ecosystem to identify recruitment, apprenticeship, internal training, high school engagement, and transportation strategies to meet immediate and long-term talent and development needs. Accepting the award on behalf of HydraForce is Tony Casal, HydraForce General Manager, and Robin Sanfran, Senior Human Resource Manager. Presenting the award are award committee members Charlie Mahoney and Nancy Eisenberg. Please come and join in congratulating them.
Well, technology is going to fail me, isn't it? Got my speech on here, so I'm not multitasking, I promise you. So I'll go off the top of my head, since technology failed me. I want to thank you. Thank you for this prestigious award. We're very honored. The management team at HydraForce is very honored. Okay, I'd like to thank our partners at Lake County. They work very hard and diligently with us. Greatly appreciate their time. I'd like to thank the selection committee for choosing HydraForce for this great award. I want to tell you I was impressed this morning by the conversation that was taking place up on the stage here. Felt it was about 15 years too late, but I'm sure you guys were all thinking about it, right? For me, it's always been a challenge for me to understand why we've pushed our young people on college and not for them to understand how important it is to just have a great job and contribute, right? And so wonderful conversation this morning, very meaningful. And to drive home that point, I want to talk about our time in 2017 for HydraForce, okay? We had a great ramp up of business. We went through 900 people, interviewed 900 people in the year, okay? 600 people actually came into HydraForce. 200 people actually stayed on as employees of HydraForce, all right? The reason why, they didn't have the skills to contribute to HydraForce, all right? So imagine the cost of the business, first of all, a great cost, right? Having to train and retrain those people, take time out from the people that are very qualified to train them, okay? So a big productivity drain on the company, but also a big drain on those poor 400 people that came in, cycled through, right, and flamed out. Imagine being those individuals going back home at night and wondering, what in the heck do I have to do different in order to be successful in my community? So there's great conversation, right? We should all feel really good about the work that you guys talked about. The work that they do for us in Lake County is wonderful and greatly appreciated, okay? You know, getting people a good job, getting them the skills that they need is all about us being able to make them successful and have them live the American dream. So thank you very much again for the award, and have a good afternoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage NAWB CEO Ron Painter and Burning Glass CEO Matt Sigelman.
Hello again. Welcome back. It's a treat. I think I may have mentioned this before. I was going to call this two dudes dialoguing data, but people sort of nixed that.
My wife would tell you that the word dude and me don't.
Well, first I want to say, so those of you who went to the industry roundtable with our partners, Matt, Burning Glass providing the data to help fuel the conversation. So amazing work. Thank you very much. We deeply appreciate that. I'm going to ask you like the beginnings of Burning Glass, because for me it's data everywhere. Like, how did Burning Glass start? How did you get there? Like, how did you guys figure out what you wanted to look at?
Yeah, data everywhere, and Norenia dropped the drink. You know, for us, we started looking at this question of understanding the job market more broadly by first looking more narrowly at understanding how you match between people and jobs. Guys who started Burning Glass were a bunch of credit card fraud guys. They realized that there's patterns that define...
Wait, they were studying credit card fraud. They were not, like, participating.
Well, that's what they claim.
Okay, all right.
The real fraud about it is that they were actually involved. The thing that calls you, you know, and annoys you in the middle of the night saying, hey, we think that was you. We think that may not have been you at Target just now. That was them. 2/3 of banks still use their software. But what they realized is that if you want to understand the world of work, you need to understand the cow paths that lead through it. How do real people move from job to job? And so they brought that to the question of how do you match people in jobs? Now that's an important question, and for the people in this room, how you make sure that we match between people and opportunity, how we make sure that employers have the talent they need, is the stuff that drives so much of the work that we do. But at the same time, we took a step back along the way and we said, you know, we wonder if we're solving the right problem, and if we need to actually define this problem more broadly. Because by the time that somebody needs a job, they either have the skills that the market needs or they don't. And then trying to train them up is a really big lift. Or by the time employers they discover they need to fill a job, well, either the right talent's available or it's not.
So this was sort of reverse engineering. If this is the transaction, somebody gets hired, then how does that actually, let's walk that back, how does that actually happen?
Exactly. What are the skills that it takes to get those jobs? And we realize that you need a market map. You need to understand what are those jobs that are in demand, what are the skills it takes to get those jobs, what's trending. When you understand that, you can come to a more effective understanding of what's the training that you need to provide, what's the gap between the skills that people have and the skills that the market needs. And we can actually account for that gap. We can train for that gap.
So in some ways, this is an issue of, for us on this side, for so long this system paid attention to, and we still do, but the focus was on the job seeker. How do we work with the individual? Why did business suddenly wake up to this, and how have they influenced how you think about from the transaction back?
Well, I think part of this is simply a question of need. When everyone's getting the talent that they need, it's harder to say, hey, we want to invest. And there's great companies, some of them like HydraForce, who have made these kinds of investments, who have stepped up and said, hey, look, we realize that there's a transition we can affect, and change in our communities. But broadly, when we approach these problems as a social problem, right? We've got a lot of job seekers who need jobs. How do we get employers to play along? Well, there you're engaging with corporate philanthropy, corporate social responsibility. When instead you say, what are the jobs that really represent pain points to the economy? What are the jobs that employers already struggle to fill and which are growing more what we call disruptive jobs? And when you focus there as a starting point, employers are so hungry for talent that you can actually move the needle in terms of how we think about sources of talent. What are the alternative sources of talent we should be considering?
So is this, is part of this mapping, like we talk a lot about career pathways, and I have to say, I think that's really critical for us to understand how that happens. I wasn't in the 9th grade thinking I want to end up as the CEO for NAWB, but how does this play against the focus on career pathways? How does business engagement, how does the data look at this?
So first, I am curious to hear what you thought you wanted to be in 9th grade.
Well, I hope I don't offend anybody. I took I think it was called the Iowa, wasn't it? The Iowa test
of basic skills.
Yeah, and it said you should be a podiatrist. I mean, I've had a lot of people in the course of time tell me where they'd like to put their foot. But I did not know that, I didn't think I was necessarily inclined for that. But anyway.
But so I'm glad you asked this question, because I think when we talk about pathways, and I think there's been this great meme about pathways in general that's been echoing in the world of workforce, but also in the world of higher education. How do we create more effective pathways? The question we really have to ask is, are those really pathways? When the pathway is a one-step process to take somebody who's from a displaced community or a underrepresented community and get them to a job, well, that's important and it's great work, but that's an on-ramp, it's not a pathway. Here's where this...
That's interesting. Say that again. So when we're mapping all this out, you see that as the on-ramp, not the pathway.
That's right. Because look, the end of the day, too often, we define the scope of work that we do in the world of workforce as being about training people for jobs. And what we actually see through analyzing millions of jobs every day is that the job market's actually defined much more by skills than by jobs. And when you define sort of the skill DNA of jobs, what are the skills that employers ask for a given job in a really detailed way, you can see how jobs relate to one another. And you can see where the effective ways, the opportunities that exist to train somebody up and to keep them progressing. Give me an example. There's a lot of people whose careers start in retail or food service or hospitality, other places that are traditionally looked at as low skill work. And in a lot of ways, they're good places to start. They're stem cell jobs because you're learning basic work skills. But that only works to the extent that we not only get you into that job in retail or hospitality or food service, but to the extent that there's a blueprint for how you keep moving up.
There's a recognition of what competencies or what skills you have. So how does that apply elsewhere?
What are adjacent jobs, and what's the difference in skills between them? I'll give you an example. We recently looked at the careers of several million people who started out in retail. And we looked at what happened to them over time. And obviously, a lot of them stay in retail, but the ones who left, you'd be surprised to find that, for example, a decent percentage, let's call it a few percent, which is actually non-trivial, right, wind up in tech jobs. You can look at that and say, wait a second, retail people winding up in tech.
Okay.
Right? That seems totally improbable, right? And when I first heard that, I said, well, this is probably just people who were working their way through college, through retail, whatever. What we actually saw was something that looked more like this. I'm in the refrigerator department at Best Buy. I move over to selling consumer electronics at Best Buy. I get some training and I move into setting up people's consumer electronics at Best Buy. I get a little more training. I get maybe some CompTIA certification, and I'm now in a proper help desk job, which is sort of a golden gateway, right? But each step along the way, the training that's needed is pretty small. It's not asking people to retrain for a whole new job, take a long period out of the workforce. The extent to which we can reshape the work that we do to focus more on those small steps and to look at a chain of small steps that move people forward, the more that our job can actually be achievable.
So this is, so how you all are looking at it is, if I'm in a local region, I'm looking at what are the critical occupations in my region, and really I've got to break that down into what are the competencies that are in that, and then start mapping that against where are the opportunities in my region?
That's exactly right. So what I want to do is I want to understand what's the opportunity landscape in my region, but also what do we know about how those jobs are likely to change? And what do we know about how those jobs relate to one another? And I think those are two related but different concepts, worth noting them separately, right? So in terms of how they're going to change, a lot of the work that we're doing is looking at not only what are the skills that are in demand for a given job, but when you look at bellwethers, you look at leading edge companies, when you look at locations that have tended to lead the curve, when you look at broad search trends and the like, they tell us a lot about the skills that are going to be defining those jobs today. So first we're looking at a given job and how that job is going to change. And then we're looking at how different jobs relate to one another. So here's a pool of people, they're underutilized, lower opportunity. What are jobs that are in high demand, and how can they draw on more available, more lower cost, and more diverse pools of talent?
Yeah, I was just looking the other day, there's some really interesting research that's now being, I guess, re-looked at, and that has to do with the multiplier on what are the critical industries, and then starting to map that across other support industries. You brought up, not only do we need to understand the taxonomy of the job today, we need to start thinking about where is that going. Not a small honor. You did some work for Davos, for the World Economic Summit. Talk about what you all were looking for in there, and maybe some of the conclusions that you saw.
Absolutely. This is a report that we co-authored, which is called Toward a Reskilling Revolution. And the notion behind it was to start from this question of automation-driven displacement. We all hear those headlines every day with the apocalyptic headlines. What percentage of workers are going to be out of job in some number of years? How many jobs that that are going to exist in 2030 haven't been born yet? All those kinds of things. And we said, look, those are real trends, and we see them. But at some level, the calculus of what percentage is kind of besides the point. We know these are going to be huge impacts. So let's look at what do you do with people who are at high automation risk. So we started out with, I think, roughly 150 jobs, which are conventionally regarded as being high automation risk. Okay. And we said, what are the skills of people in those jobs? And then we said, okay, instead of thinking about how do we retrain those people all the way up for new jobs, which is pretty hard to do, right? We said, let's look at jobs that require a lot of those same skills and figure out, are there opportunities where we could train for the delta in something, for that gap between them, in something like 6 to 12 training months. We found a universe of jobs, and we found, in fact, that most people at high automation risk, when you think in those terms, go from having maybe 1 or 2 opportunities which pay about $8,000 worse, to having up to 10 opportunities as an average, which pay about $14,000 better. And here was the next thing which we did, though. We said, okay, great. So now we can define the difference between people who are at risk and the skills they have and jobs that represent good opportunities in the future. And we define it in a much narrower skill-based way. Then we can say, okay, how do we actually define ROI? How do we define the return on investment in training? Because that's one of those things that's been so elusive. We all look to be able to prove to employers that this is stuff you ought to invest in. We look to convince legislatures. This is stuff you ought to invest in, but the data aren't there because we're always trying to look at this job to job. When you look at skill to skill, we can say, how much does it cost to train this skill?
Right.
And what we found was that employers themselves, without any kind of subsidy, can get for about 30% of high automation risk workers, employers will get a positive ROI on training them up to higher value, lower automation risk jobs. And the public sector, so workforce boards and other agencies, that ROI goes to about 80%. So about 80% of high automation risk workers can be trained up at positive ROI when you think about the cost in terms of unemployment or underemployment and tax benefits and the like.
So does that speak to the more utilization or the better utilization of incumbent worker training?
Exactly.
And this is not long. This is short, bang, kind of what's the next step across our regional labor force? Because maybe it's not with this organization, but it is in another area of need.
Incumbent worker training has always traditionally been, let's face it, sort of the red-headed stepchild in the world of workforce, right? Because at the end of the day, we've got pressing things we got to do, which is we've got to be able to deal with jobs that are going away with people who don't have jobs. And okay, well, those people have jobs.
Right.
We'll deal with that later. But the reality is, as we look at millions of jobs every day, all the stuff that you're hearing about, all these millions of jobs that haven't been born and whatever, we're not seeing tons of that yet, to be honest. What we're seeing is that the jobs we're all used to thinking about are changing and changing fast. There are whole occupations where 40% of the skills that are required today are different from the ones that were required just a decade ago. 40%. It's a profound rate of change. And so that means that workers need to have a mechanism, need an infrastructure for acquiring the skills that will enable them to stay relevant. And it means that employers need to be able to access an infrastructure for making sure that their workers remain valuable. And I think that's a critical role that America's workforce system plays.
Nick Pinchuk, CEO for Snap-on, was here yesterday. And as we were having a conversation, one of the things that he said was his observation of the future is to look at different time periods. And when you think about the number of patents that were filed, the number of like crazy advances, 1910 to about late 30s produced more patents, more innovation than we have produced since the 1980s. And so he was saying, look more toward the incremental than you look toward the radical, because he sort of feels like we're going to see that. And that's almost, is that sort of what I'm hearing you say is, look, this is, in the short, we can think about what's going to happen, but let's in the short term think about the incremental.
I think that's right. And I think it's not just about incremental change, though, in terms of technology, right? We're used to thinking, I mentioned before, how fast jobs are changing. We're used to thinking of that as essentially technology change. So new tools emerge, okay, great. That's an incremental change. But to some extent, what we're seeing is actually more profound than that. Because traditionally, the skills that defined a job were pretty linear. Right? So What are the skills you need to be an accountant? Well, they're mostly accounting skills. Now let's look at another job that's very much involved with a lot of data. So accountants on the one side. Let's compare them with data scientists. So a data scientist is different not just because it's born of a different epoch. Data scientists are different because they require a lot of different kinds of skills. Yes, they require data skills, but they also require programming skills. They require business skills to be able to put data in context. They require a lot of critical thinking skills, right? So increasingly what we're seeing is that the jobs of the future are blending sets of skills in ways that they never have before. Marketing managers, we all know people in marketing, right? Well, marketing people a lot of times went into marketing because it was a right brain job. But increasingly, we want marketing people to be able to manipulate customer data, left brain skill. And that challenges the supply chain and it challenges workers.
Yeah, I was sitting down with CompTIA yesterday, and that was part of what they were saying is that once upon a time you thought of this worker and you thought this was their skill. Now what we're doing is piling skill on skill and competency on competency. So it's almost like a race to how many competency or certifications can I have. Let me turn our attention to, you do a lot of look at WIOA and at the data that's being produced out of these systems. How come system can't talk to system? Where are we in that conversation?
I never professed any genius, so I think you're asking the wrong guy. But I think there's two levels of that question, right? One is a mechanical question. And that's, hey, there's data coming from here, there's data coming from here, and how do those pipes connect? But there's a broader question there, which is how do we make sure that WIOA lives up to its structure as a community, its promise as a way of bringing together communities? And right now, this goes back to your point about data everywhere, and my rejoinder that Norania dropped a drink. We've got lots of flows of data coming in, and whether they actually connect into a single holding tank or not is a whole other question. But what we find is that for effective community action, there needs to be a single source of truth. We need everyone to be singing from the same hymnal. And too often that's not the case. A lot of the work that we've increasingly been doing has been working at a community level, places like Birmingham, Alabama, and places like Pittsburgh, to figure out what's a broad talent strategy. Where are the sectors that exist today going? Where are the sectors that we're targeting? What's their complexion looking like and going to look like in the future? What are the skills you need to bring those sectors home? When you have that strategy, then you can start to pull the data together in ways that will be effective. But otherwise, what you have too often is a lot of data, but not a lot of actionability. I think one of the things that was sort of interesting to me in looking at WIOA, it had a lot of language, very carefully chosen language in it around accountability. And it's exciting language because the notion that we should be accountable in the way that we all deeply feel in this room for outcomes is key. Unfortunately, in the world of regulation, accountability gets translated to accounting, right? So the focus gets on, hey, how do we generate more data? How do we ship more data? But what we need to get to actionability, true accountability, is how do we decide what are the data that really speak to that talent strategy for our region? When you can develop that strategy, you can have impact.
It's almost, is it in some ways, when we're talking to an employer, as much as they're looking for very technical skills, they also come back to us and talk about those core skills. And we have a lot of conversation about how do we know that I can adequately read and write and do those kind of things and math. In our world, it's how do we focus on the fundamentals of how do you do collaboration, how do you do partnership, how do you do exchange of information, how do you do strategy together? Is that part of what I'm hearing? And somehow you got to have a belief system in what data you're going to look at, right? There's no I've often been cautioned, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. Is that part of this?
I think that's exactly right. We tend to focus on some specific magic bullet skill of the day. Think, okay, well, everyone's got to have data skills. Everyone's got to have programming skills, whatever. And by the way, they probably do. But what we know is that fundamentally, for people to be, I remember I was talking a few minutes ago about how these jobs are changing, right? So that means people have to be able to reinvent themselves over time. That's not about necessarily just acquiring the latest technical skill. It means that people need to have the core foundations to be able to apply those skills too. We recently released a report for the Business Higher Ed Forum looking at what the foundational skills are for the 21st century jobs. And what we found was that in addition to sort of the core kinds of basic skills that we're all used to thinking about, we found that there's a sets of business skills, data skills, and the like, which are increasingly in demand. But here's what we also found, and this is sort of interesting, right? Because we're all used to thinking about, and so much of the work that folks in this room do is in figuring out how we develop that core employability. We're used to thinking about foundational skills as being the bottom row of the USDA food pyramid, right? That's carbohydrates. Over time, right, you know, people master that.
Oh, I know carbohydrates.
We'll get to that later. What are the, where's the protein? What's the technical sets of skills that people have to acquire over time? What we actually found was that as jobs, people move north, further and further north in their careers, the skills that are more emphasized are the foundational skills. So actually, we're seeing a flipping of that pyramid, that we need to make sure that people have those core foundational skills, not just because they need to be able to get the job today, but because those actually become the skills that serve people longitudinally over time. It also speaks...
That makes sense, because as you move up, you start to manage more and more people who have very technical expertise.
That's right.
So you're not so much in that, you're now in that, how do you collaborate across systems?
It also speaks to this growing role, or the expanded role that workforce can play in this equation. Because we think about broadening the role of workforce to be not just about how do we get people jobs, but how do we make sure that people stay in jobs, how do people become more valuable over time. And it means that we need to make sure that we have an infrastructure for not only providing the core employability skills, but that we're providing an infrastructure for making sure that workers, including incumbent workers, have a mechanism for acquiring the sort of more timely skills that are going to change over time, those technical skills.
So truly thinking about the systems that tie our communities together.
Exactly.
Matt Sigelman, CEO for Burning Glass, thank you very much for taking time out to join us.
So much fun, Ron.